Getting into modes can be difficult to wrap your head around. Today, I get you started with the what, where, and how of the easiest mode to learn, the Mixolydian mode. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome, friends, to episode 139 of the Play Guitar Podcast. I'm Lee, and this is the podcast that's determined to make you a better guitar player. No matter if you're just starting out or you've been playing for years, this is the show that will help you become the guitarist that you always wanted to be. I've talked about modes in the past, but if you haven't checked out those episodes yet, here's a quick explanation of what modes are. Playing a mode is another way to get different sounds out of the scale patterns you already know. How are we going to do that? By changing the tonal center, changing the strong note. We're going to change that to another note in the scale. One of the most used modes is Mixolydian mode. And why? Well, it's because it's based around a very widely used chord, the dominant chord, the seventh chord. Or you can think of it as the flat 7 chord. The dominant happens naturally in most common major diatonic progressions. That's chord progressions that are built off the major scale. And the most common one is the 5-7 to 1. But you've also heard the sound in other uses as well. It happens by force in blues, happens by force in rock, and it happens by force in funk music. And don't worry, it's not weird. It's not a weird scale. It's not a foreign sound to your ears. So today we're going to spend some time with a group of notes that deserves a lot of attention, the Mixolydian mode. Okay, so let's answer some questions. What's the Mixolydian mode? Mixolydian mode is the 5th mode of the major scale. For example, we're going to take the C major scale. We're just going to use pattern 1. And we're going to start and end on the note G. Okay, so let's go take a listen to that. Here's pattern 1 of the C major scale. Let's count our way up to G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the 5th note after the tonic note. And now we're going to take all the way across the scale from G to the next G. When you listen to this, it's very major sounding. It's a happy sound. Everything sounds familiar until you get to the last note. Right there. Check it out. That's something different. There's something different that's going on there. We have a mostly tension-free scale until you get to that 7th note after the G. And here's what it would be if it was major. But we're not. It's lowered 1 fret. The lowering of the last note in the scale, it adds something different than your regular happy and sad sounding chords. It becomes unsettled. It wants to go somewhere. And that in itself, that's tense. It's not at rest. It wants to go somewhere. The lower 7th occurs in the major scale naturally when you do this, when you play from the 5th to the next 5th of any scale. The way to approach this traditionally has been by using the parent and child scales, meaning the parent, the C major scale, and the child scale coming from the scale. Can you hear the difference? Major, Mixolydian. Let's see here. Thinking about this, and probably why a lot of players tend to avoid modes in particular. And the thinking is in two parts. Well, I need to play my C major patterns, but I have to think of them starting on the G. That's kind of a disconnect for a lot of people. I know a lot of people start off, they try to do them, and they can do them. They understand, well, if I start on the G, it works out. But when you're actually playing and to have to think, well, I got to find my way to the G. I'm playing in C, but I'm starting in G. It becomes a bit of a disconnect. So we're going to talk about another way of getting this sound out of scales that you already know. Most they think of this scale differently as a G major scale. Since we're in the key, if you're playing in the key of G, say you're playing over a chord that starts and ends on a G7. What a lot of people will do is they'll think of this as a G major scale, and then they'll just take that seventh note and lower it one. Instead of, it's only one note, but it makes a world of difference. And it's much easier to think about the mode this way. And one problem I see a lot is that some people, I think this comes from the caged kind of learning. Some people think that the major scale pattern that starts on a G note on the low E string, a lot of people think that that's the Mixolydian position, and that's all they play is that one scale, and that's completely not the truth. You can get the G Mixolydian sound or the Mixolydian sound anywhere on the neck of the guitar in any of the positions. And I think because caged in caged where each chord shape gets its own pattern, a lot of people think that modes must behave that way, and I'm not sure, but I got a sneaking suspicion that's how they do that. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a G Mixolydian scale in both ways in a few different patterns. But I'm going to quickly check the chat really quick before we start moving on. So we've got Dean's here. Dean was first. Evan's here too. Coke got the notification this time half hour ago. Okay. Awesome. All right. Chris is here too. So we got a great crowd. And Coke's not a big fan of Valkyrian either. Yeah. So, and Dino's here too. So great. We got a great crowd here today. And let's go on back in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a few of these scales in different positions. Let me actually get this out of the way here. So let's do the parent scale with the fifth. We're just going to quickly go through our C major scales, starting on G. That's our pattern 1, pattern 2. Here's C. So now in pattern 2, we have our G starting at the 10th fret on the A string. Notice it puts the flat 7 in there for us in the patterns we already know. Okay, let's see here. Pattern 3. The same 10th fret. This one's kind of nice because it ends with that flat 7 of the G, the F. Okay, so we'll go to 4. Here's C in 4. We're going to a nice lower G here. Okay, and then 5. This is the one that a lot of people think is the Mixolydian scale pattern. So we can actually, it's a C scale pattern, but we can go all the way down to the lowest note of this pattern that flat 7 is put in there for us. All right, so the first way to use that is use the parent scale, find the 5th. That's what we just did. And, it's just a C major scale with a new starting point. The next is lowering the 7th to the G. It's lowering the F sharp, the F. Let's see here. So we have G major. And what we're going to do is we're going to lower where we would put the flat 7th normally in a C major scale, and this G major scale pattern 2 at the 3rd fret. We're going to take 3, 4, 5, 6 and flat that note. Now, if you are familiar with these scale patterns, you're going to start to see something. Even though I'm thinking of this in the key of G, and even though I'm making a change to it, it still comes out looking like C pattern 5. Okay, so it's all about how you think about that. And that's important because when you're playing, things are going fast. You don't have a whole lot of time to stop. So, yeah, very different. I know that when I'm playing in funk music or blues music or even like modal jazz music, anytime where the 1 chord is a dominant chord, where it starts off on, in our case, a G7, I think of it in the key of G. I don't like to think, well, this is C major, but I'm going to start on a different note. I think of it in the key of G, and I make that change of the 7th. It's a real easy way to go. It's the same sound, but you see it differently. It's not in like a chord progression, a diatonic chord progression in the key of C. But the other way, the parent-child thinking, when I'm playing over a Mixolydian, and there's a dominant chord that's not the main chord in the progression, 5 chord going back to 1. That's where I'll use the parent-child. So let's see here. Let's go there for a minute. The Mixolydian is the mode that matches the harmony of the dominant 7th chord. It's been argued in many progressions that the 5-1 progression is the strongest in music. It's very final. So let's play a little bit of that. So 5-1. So we're in the key of C. Our 1 chord is a C chord. What would our 5 chord be? That's a G7th chord. Back to the 1. So doesn't get much stronger than that. Even if you start off on the G7th chord out of nowhere, it sounds like it needs to go somewhere. And it wants to resolve back to the... See, if we resolved it to... Let's try it to like a 2 chord. 2, 3. Not strong. Not strong. Always wants to go back to that 1 chord. So that's the tension that's built into the dominant sound. Wants to go somewhere and gives the tonic chord gives it the strongest place to resolve. So if you play a melody over this dominant chord, you would want to match your notes that match that tension of the G7 with the scale that fits it with the flat 7. So how does it start for a lot of people? How do you go ahead and get started using the Mixolydian mode? Well, when you start playing over chord progressions, just regular chord progressions, and realize that all you have to do is play the major scale and it works for all of the chords, that's usually everyone's kind of aha moment. That's when you say, okay, I get it. I can just play this one scale over the whole chord progression and it works. I don't have to think, and I'm getting something that sounds pretty decent. It opens up the door to soloing. And playing one thing, even though those chords are changing, it sounds great. What happens next, though? Eventually you realize that the major scale's quality, the way it sounds, depends on what chord is playing underneath it at the time. So your C major scale sounds different when the G chord is playing as opposed to when the C chord is playing. So I'm gonna put down some G's and C's here. Let me get a looper going. So first step everybody plays. Okay. C major scale. Same scale. Back to the C major. Everything sounds just a little bit different over the G chord, where our C is very strong on the first chord. Here's our second chord. Does that C sound good? Let me do it a higher register. So here's the 1 chord. It's going to change to G7 right here. So your ear starts to tell you as you move up the ladder that the note that sounds wonderful, even though all the chords are in the same key, that note that sounds wonderful on one key doesn't sound good at all on some of the other chords. And what's happening is your strong notes and your weak notes change from chord to chord to chord. That's where, so your ear develops, and this is your first step towards thinking of playing chord to chord. The strong notes and the weak notes change, and how this affects us is that when you're playing a major scale over the diatonic chord progression, Mixolydian happens when the 5 chord happens, and major, Ionian major happens when the 1 chord happens. Okay, so even though you're not thinking, you're just going through these scales, because those chords are changing underneath, it completely reverses, doesn't reverse, completely changes up your strong notes and weak notes. How about in our other scenario we've been talking about, in like a blues setting, funk, or a rock setting, where the dominant chord is the 1 chord, okay? Where you're starting off on a dominant chord and you're planning on ending on a dominant chord. How did this happen? How do we get songs that start off on a dominant chord, the chord that's made to go somewhere else, to resolve back to 1? How do we get there? It's something that happened over time. We've decided collectively that we like the sound of the 7th chord. We like the tension it brings. So much so, we like the tension that we've built whole styles of music around this sound. We feature the sound. I happen to like this sound. It's one of my favorite sounds, blues and funk, revolving around the 7th chord. The common practice of using a dominant chord in place of the 1, it calls for the Mixolydian mode. It becomes your inside sound. It's your scale that perfectly matches your chord. But the problem is, if you listen to a lot of blues and a lot of funk music, this may or may not be what you want to play. It's very common to add some more tension by playing relatively out kind of sounds over top of these 7th chords. The big example, minor pentatonic. The minor pentatonic scale, we've all played that over 7th chords. It's what most of us start off playing. It sounds great, but sometimes you need a melody that matches perfectly to the chord, and Mixolydian is what you'd use. The song that I always like to refer back to the classic, to me, Mixolydian song. It's called Freeway Jam by Jeff Beck. It's a great example of this. It's also in jazz, but not bebop, in bebop, in non-modal jazz. It's the 5 chord, the Mixolydian mode being played over 5 chord. It's usually in a 2-5-1. So 2-5-1 in the key of C is D minor 7, G7 to C major 7. Okay, that's the most common jazz progression. It's traditional jazz is built on that progression, and it's just like the diatonic, the C to G that we're playing before it. These are chords that come from the major scale. So you can play these 3 chords. And every note of the major scale will work over top of those 3 chords. You can do that all day long. Will it work? Yes. But you're going to have the most inside sound over those chords. The 2 chord, when you play C major, that's a Dorian sound. The 5 chord is what we're talking about today, the Mixolydian sound. And then the 1 chord is the Ionian sound. That's too like vanilla, that's too inside for a lot of players. Players start to experiment with things. They start trying to try different scales to get some different sounds, to get a varying amount of tension, especially over the chord we're talking about today, the 5 chord, the dominant chord. But the standard Mixolydian sound is old faithful. You can always go back there and get that inside sound where you match the chord perfectly. Okay, so I'm going to go check the chat real quick before we go to our last section. Let's see here. So we got a couple things. Let's go back here. So Chris says, I understand modes. I just haven't got to a point where hey, let's go all Mixolydian. I suppose that comes with experience over chords. Yeah, it does. And, and some of the things I'm talking about today, Chris, are kind of can focus in on really the uses of Mixolydian. I think of Mixolydian like a major scale. It's very not plain, but it's very, very perfect. When you play that over a 5/7, it's very perfect. And then the outside sound is the minor pentatonic sound. And if you start to think of it that way, anytime you're over a dominant 7th chord and you go back and forth between those two, you get some really nice, nice sounds going back and forth between those. And there's a lot of other scales that you can use to add a lot more tension to it too. He also says, one of the things on my to try list is to write the notes of, say, D Phrygian, work out some chords I can play from the scale notes, and use that to solo after creating a progression. You could do that now. It wouldn't be, you wouldn't be used to it yet, but nothing wrong with starting that now. That's a great way to go. Evan says, I worry about getting confused with the modes, like slipping into the major scale accidentally. I think today I've been talking about 2 approaches. One is the parent scale with the child scale, and that's the one that is really tough to wrap your head around at first. But for you, Evan, for doing that, taking the scales that you're familiar with and knowing, well, what note in the major scale is going to give me that Mixolydian sound, and taking that 7th note and changing them. That way you always have a basis. Your major scales, your minor scales is kind of your rock, and then you can do minor things to those and get these sounds at first. Over time, it all kind of blends together. It's just really 2 different ways to move forward that end up in the same place. Coke says the easiest way I've used the mode is after finally understanding it by using Phrygian on a pentatonic and suddenly realized I just nailed a Santana lick by accident. That's awesome, man. That's great. That is great. That's awesome. Brennan's here. Brennan says, when you think about modes, do you think about it in terms of the parent major scale? Meaning, do you think the Mixolydian mode is the parent scale starting on the fifth? No, well, no. The parent scale would be the major scale. So Mixolydian, any of the modes would be a child scale off of that. So that's that one way of thinking. So even if you're in Dorian, right? So the 2 in the key of C is a D. And if you play from D to D on that C major scale, you'll get D Dorian. That's a child scale of the main scale, which is the C. So the Dorian on the G, that's the Mixolydian. Those are all the child scales that are built off of the parent scale, which is C. And that's the way and that's what I was talking about before. People have a hard time wrapping their heads around that. So for people who have struggled and are working towards really wanting to play this, really want to get these sounds, but have a hard time with that, finding out what and actually we're doing a lot of mode stuff in the next few months. Today's show is I'm explaining the modes, and I'm explaining how they work and some ways of an easier way of going about that. But some more stuff's coming up. And I'll talk about that at the end there. And then he said, or do you think about the mode as the major scale starting on the fifth with a flat seventh? Well, that other way is you could think about our example was in the key of C, and we were trying to get the G Mixolydian mode out of that. And the one way we talked about is playing our C major scale and going G to G. And the C major scale puts all of those accidentals, all of the notes that are changed, it's in there automatically. It's like a slide rule. I don't know if you remember slide rules, where you'd have a top layer with boxes, little holes punched out of it, and then you'd slide different numbers underneath, and the equations would work themselves out, right? The C major scale is kind of like that. We'd start on the G, and if you just play the C major scale, that flat 7 is automatically put in there. The other way is you could know what's different from G Mixolydian than G major. So you could take a G major scale and just make that change, where you wouldn't have to use the parent scale. You would just know, okay, on the 7th, I'm going to lower that one. There's 2 ways to go. Okay, so let's see here. He says, I think of C Mixolydian as G major with a flat 7, or G Mixolydian as G major with a flat 7. Okay. Evan's got some work calls. That's right. And Dean says that's good. That was a really good question, Brandon. And asking that question is really one of the reasons why I'm doing this show here, because it's a hard thing to start, but once you get over an initial kind of let's see, what does it really? It's not like a speed bump, but it's just getting going on this. And once your ear and your fingers match up, that's when everything starts getting a little bit better. Okay. All right. So we got one more section left here, and we're going to talk about, let's get this up here. How would you start to use the Mixolydian mode? Okay. So the first step is to include the Mixolydian mode as part of your practice, as part of your major scales and major progression practices. So when you're practicing your scale, learn to practice Mixolydian in all the positions, starting and ending on the 5th as well. So C today, so we're just going to stay in C. And here's our C pattern 5. And what I like to do is I would play an arpeggio. I play the scale just all the way up and all the way back. And then I would start on the 5. So I'd start on the G. Let's see here. I'm sorry. And then I play the 1. So I play C major. So G. To the 1. And then maybe go into the next pattern. So here's pattern 1. Play it in G. Well, let's see here. Arpeggio. And then play it in C. We could do it. Here's pattern 2. Start on G. And then C. Let's see, pattern 3. Start on the G. Arpeggio. And let's see, we've got one more, pattern 4. So here's pattern 4. We'll start on the G. G 7 arpeggio. And then C major. So you see, I'm playing the same group of notes, but I'm accenting the new tonal center when I'm going to the G Mixolydian. So, and it's also training your ear. You can hear that tension. So I play the whole collection of notes, and then I play from G to G. You start to hear that tension. Then I do the arpeggio. You really start to hear it, and it wants to go somewhere. Then I go back to the C major scale, up and down, and then do the C major arpeggio. So I've outlined that progression 2 ways, with the full scale and with the arpeggios. So you get the Mixolydian sound, and you get the major sound, which is also called the Ionian sound. So let's go. That's one way you could start to get that in there. Next, you could find, let's see here, dominant 7s in all positions and combine the modes with arpeggios, kind of what we just did right there. We're getting these under our fingers, and we're training our ears at the same time. And here's a way we can move forward again, is by taking some licks and lowering the 7th. This is using how I would practice if you weren't wanting to use the parent-child scales. This way you could take some major licks, some G major guitar licks that you may already play, and then change them by lowering the 7th. Okay, so here's G major. There's my G major. So let's use that. Let's say that's one of my licks. I'm going to go up a G major scale. Not a great lick, but... So I'd have to change this F sharp. I'd have to lower it 1. Or here. Oh. I played that over, doesn't work, right? Over 7th chord. It's terrible. Perfect sounds on there. So just by changing the one note, all of a sudden now my pretty sound becomes more funky. So that's another way that you could start getting into using the Mixolydian mode. And by taking things that you already know and just taking a little bit of time to think about what the notes in the scale are, you really just got to find one, the 7th, the one that the F sharp in this, we're playing over G7. That F sharp needs to be lowered to an F. And if you know guitar keys, in the key of C, all keys, not just guitar keys, in the key of C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That F, it doesn't have a sharp in it. So when you play from G to G in the key of C, there's going to be a natural F, not a sharp F2. So that's a good first step for people who have trouble wrapping their head around modes, lowering the 7th and major scales. Now let's do this something. Let's play that lick over the 7th chord, build off the tonic. We've done that. One of the common jazz scales, this is the last thing I want to talk about. One of the common jazz scales that played a lot is called the Bebop scale. And the Bebop scale goes through the same process as well, but it also does one thing. It doesn't get rid of anything. So everything that we've done as far as when we're in the key of G and we take this F sharp and lower it one, we're replacing that F sharp. But what the Bebop scale is, it adds to it. So we have our G note over G7, and in major, that's our major 7th. And what we've been doing is taking that major 7th and lowering it to sound dominant. But in the Bebop scale, they leave them all together. Do you hear that? This sound, that chromatic stepwise. So it's basically, to me, it's a Mixolydian sound with a passing tone. We're working our way back. And that's always, let's see here. Let me get a G7 going here. There's our Mixolydian. Now here is the Bebop scale. It's a neat sound. And then actually using a little minor pentatonic with it. So that's something else I wanted to bring to your attention. It's another way of getting that Mixolydian sound, but adding a little more color to it. So the last thing that you could do is what I just did is alternating the Mixolydian sound with the minor pentatonic scale. The Mixolydian mode has that tension of 5-1, but you could still add more. And because we're so used to that, it doesn't feel quite so tense anymore because there's so many songs that use that sound. Going back and forth between the minor pentatonic and the Mixolydian can really give you some really nice sounds and really make music interesting. Let's see here. I think that's everything that I wanted to get into today. Let's talk about an assignment for you. I'd like for you to do some experimenting this week. I want you to experiment with the Mixolydian mode. And then my next assignment for you is to come back next week and download next week's podcast, where I feature a bunch of Mixolydian licks all for you, so you can start practicing. So go ahead and tune in next week, okay? That's a wrap. Thank you for joining me today for the Play Guitar Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player. Also, I really appreciate it if you could leave a review for the show. If you're just starting or you're new to the guitar, head on over to starthereguitar.com and check out my premium 11-week beginner's course that gives you all the foundations you need to move forward correctly on the guitar. Follow me on all my different social media pages. Links to them are at playguitaracademy.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next episode. Okay, there's the podcast. We're going to do a little hanging out and chat for the rest of the time we have. We have a good bit of time. I'm going to turn the recording off right there. Let's see. Let's go back here. Okay, we got a bunch. Here we go. Okay, found where I was before. I don't want to miss any here. Okay. Brennan says, I think slide rule is a great analogy. Yeah, it's not too many people know what a slide rule is anymore, but it works out perfect. You know, you've got windows and a whole bunch of numbers underneath those windows, and for what you want to do, they change. Our scale patterns are like those windows. The patterns don't change, but if you move the notes underneath them, it puts in all of the different sharps and flats that you need for different situations. It says, yes, I'll admit to being another member of the slide rule. Yeah. Generation. Yeah. It's Evan says, I don't think I've ever seen a slide rule before. Yeah. I had a long time ago. Let's see here. Chris says, I came along just after the slide rule, but I often heard of this mythical object of maths, right? From my more learned peers and weather-beaten work colleagues. I think I was just right on the end of it. We didn't actually use. I think they just showed it to us for this is what you used to have to use there. Let's see here. Evan says it sounds off as a standalone scale, but natural against the right chord progression. Yeah, and it's you just got to get your ear kind of on it there. And Kevin says it sounds like the lick in Pretty Woman. Boom, 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 boom. Flat 7, right? Down. Also, boom, 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 boom. Day Tripper, it's in that too. That flat 7 notes in a lot of different songs. It looks like we got stuck there for a minute. Stuck in the modal with you. Stuck in froze, and then things didn't match up. Milli Vanilli. Right. And Chris likes the assignment. Okay, well, I hope I caught up for everybody. We've had a storm coming through here that may have had something to do with it there. David says, good stuff. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. Great to have you here. Hope everybody's doing good this week. I'm not sure how things are going to go next week. I am starting to write ahead in the podcast because I know there's going to be some that I'm going to have to kind of catch up a little bit. So Oh, I'm still that way, huh? Oh, well. He says something. Cook says I'm looking a little like a kung fu actor for me. So I'm getting ahead in the assignments. I mean, in the podcast. So I don't know. I still want to do video, so I may pre-record some things, but definitely going to make sure that I have content every week, even if I have to drop out a little bit for that. So that's kind of what's happening this week for me. And David says the thing I've been thinking about all day is I hope the Storms miss Evan this week. Yeah, Evan, you didn't get just one. You got two. I know you're probably working right now. But we're all here. There he is. There he is. He says, "You and me both, David. Thanks for the well wishes. Tons of well wishes for Evan this week." I was thinking about that as I saw the path that the hurricanes, or I guess they're tropical storms at this point, but they're going to be hurricanes if they haven't already. So stay safe, Evan. As if we don't have enough things to stay safe from, right? Okay. All right, everybody. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it. Thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon. And try a little bit of Mixolydian. You should be able to sit down and try and get that sound. And at this point, understand why it sounds the way it sounds and what the uses are. And we've got some really cool licks next week. I'm going to be going through all the different licks for you, and I think I'm going to put the tabs up in the Facebook group next week for that one too. So we should have some good Mixolydian licks coming up for us next week. And Evan says one is going to miss us mostly, the other's going to ride the coast, and that could be a problem. Yeah, they weren't really. I think I forget which one was heading. I think it was west. I don't know. At this point, I've been out of it, getting ready for this, so I don't know. But that's right. Yucks. Good luck, Evan. Man, have a very very safe week. I'm gonna get rid of that banner right there. And if anybody has any questions or anything this week, I will be available by email, so just let me know. And it was great hanging out with everybody. And Dino says, could you put the licks on PGA too? I sure can. I will upload those. I have to make a new section because I want to have a section where all of the free stuff that I have is there in one place. So for people who are in the academy to do that. So I'll work on that this week. I'll write that down right now. Licks on the PGA website. Okay. All right. Thanks, Dino. I appreciate that. And Evan says Marco is headed west. Right. Okay. So my information is still how it's going. Okay. Well, good luck, Evan. Thanks everybody for hanging out with me. I hope my voice and the picture finally got back in sync. And I will see you later on in the week. If I'm not live, I will definitely see all of the coaching students for their videos next weekend. All right. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.